Hey everybody, welcome to Pastor Have You Seen This? A production of Allen Creek Community Church, where we just take content from the web, stuff that relates to things that will be interesting for Christians, for non-Christians, people who are maybe skeptical, or people who are just investigating what faith is all about, and just take some of this content that relates to big ideas, morality, God, the Bible, the intersection of Christianity with culture, and just see what a Christian pastor would say about it. And maybe that'll be helpful for you to kind of frame the Christian faith for you. So without further ado, let's look at this. Oh, by the way, if you have something you'd like to send in, maybe you'd like to have us to comment on it, feel free to send it to social@ac3.org, and we will be happy to comment on it. So this one's called Why Unity is a Big Deal. Let's watch.
A boy through hormonal treatment and surgical mutilation. No, the government's job is not to control our kids. God gave kids to parents. Back off and pound sand while you're at it. The church has not gotten more political. Politics have gotten exponentially more religious. If politics was about streets and paving highways and digging reservoirs and funding our military all day long, whatever. But when you start telling us about the nature of truth, we have to have a conversation. If you're not in trouble as a church family, you're just not preaching the gospel. Because to contend for the gospel truth is to be at war with the current politics of our day. It's not as if we're looking for a fight. It's like, we've been standing over here the whole time. And all of a sudden, they're getting closer, closer, closer. And now they're throwing punches. And so you have two options. You can shrink away in cowardice, or you can stand with some backbone and you can contend for the truth. No, two men can't get married because we don't get to define marriage. God does. No, abortion is not reproductive health care. It's murdering a child made in the image of God. No, a girl can decide to be a boy through hormonal treatment and surgical mutilation. No, the government's job is not to control our kids. God gave kids to parents. Back off and...
Okay, so we cycled around. So my first thought was that I think that there's something to the impression here that that the Christian church hasn't become more bellicose or belligerent. And so that actually is a contentious thing that I just said. But that is his point, right? His point is that the church hasn't become more bellicose, belligerent, antagonistic, fight-oriented. The culture has become more antagonistic to the church. That's his point. And I think there's something to that. Like, I guess here's the deal. Can it be both? And can the church have become more fight-oriented when it comes to the culture wars and the big moral questions that are besieging us right now, and at the same time feeling like the culture has also become more fight-oriented and more war? I think that probably is true. Like, think about what I just said. I think that if the war is intensifying, that may mean that both sides have scaled up their rhetoric and scaled up maybe their level, their sense of existential threat levels, like, DEFCON 4. And so the culture, that is to say the secular institutions outside the church, feel a level of DEFCON 4 about the church right now. And they will say things like, the church wants to institute a theocracy. The church wants to impose morality on everybody. The church is, wanting to basically control speech and morality and all that kind of stuff. And I'm certain that there's a segment of the church that does. But I do think that there's something about the idea that the church is getting more... is getting louder in the culture war because it feels encroached upon. And actually that's interesting because I'm talking about that. Dan and I are actually spending 4 sessions in a men's retreat talking really about that how now should we live in an era where the moral cultural center is no longer defined by the church. Now, he's presuming that the church's stance on things like abortion and marriage should define the cultural stance, and I don't know that that's true. So I don't know that he's giving enough of a nod to the fact that Christians live in a pluralistic society. And if we live in a pluralistic society, our definition of marriage, it would be great if everybody agreed to it. But there's been massive moral drift on that, and nobody, and not everybody does. In fact, I would say probably 51 to put a number on it. At least half of the population no longer defines marriage the way the church does. So how then should we do marriage in a pluralistic context where Christians are no longer get to define the center? I think that's the part he's missing. If Christians aren't defining the moral center, then we, it doesn't mean that Christians don't continue, I think, to advocate for their moral framework, because we believe that if our moral framework descends from God, who made everybody in his image, and this God ultimately wants to bless and to expand human flourishing, because that's what God does. He wrote the design manual. If we believe that that's true of our general moral framework, then we would have no problem and no embarrassment advocating for that in the public square. So Christian view of human life, Christian view of sexuality. But if the church is outvoted on that, which it seems like it is, depending on how you look at it, obviously when it comes to marriage, that Christian vision of marriage has not been, is no longer set at the center of the culture. It's obviously not. So then I think the church has got a new, sort of fight in front of us, and that's to how to continue to walk faithfully in Jesus and recognize that our advocacy for our moral positions is a delicate matter, because you could very easily see that pressing for a moral stance that someone else doesn't agree with could look like an imposition of values. So now, at the same time, laws have a teaching effect, right? So most states had, they were passing referendums on marriage with large majorities to keep it as generally a Christian definition of marriage. And then all of a sudden the Supreme Court ruled on it, and then boom, everybody changed. So instead of having these large majorities affirming a traditional view, suddenly it's well, the Supreme Court said it's no longer, the traditional view is no longer a moral one. Therefore, it flipped the script, and it led to a massive shift. So, that's it's very, very complicated. This video comes right to the heart of the culture war, and I think that the Christian's best way forward is, vote your conscience by all means, but when it comes to advocacy in the public square, be very sensitive to how the imposition of your Christian values may not be perceived as an advancement of human flourishing. Now, just be aware of that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but just be aware of that. And by all means, live that out. One of the great things that hurts the Christian case for a Christian view of ethics in the public square is when Christians don't do the thing that they advocate other people to do. So they don't advance or live by faithful, loving, heterosexual monogamy. Well, then it tends to undercut in the public mind the efficacy of that model. When Christians have abortions at, hundreds and hundreds of thousands every single year, which they do, it kind of undercuts the case that they make about the value of human life from conception to natural death. So I think that's a really big issue that Christians need to take to heart and look and get their own house in order. And if Christians were living so starkly differently on issues of sexuality and human value than the rest of the culture, which is clearly moving in a different direction, I think then the divide gets wider. That bumps up the rhetoric, but in some sense, if you take the rhetoric out of it, it should bump up the beauty, the truth, and the goodness of the Christian moral framework. And that should be its own sermon. That should be its own, what I want to say, a political campaign. It would be a campaign without saying a word, because it would just be Christians by the millions living faithfully to their their public moral stances. And I think that might have a larger teaching effect and actually move the needle on issues that are affecting us deeply, on the issues of sex and human value, than any political campaign and any sort of bellicose, belligerent, push in the public square. By the way, just to finish this, and I know this is a pretty long, Pastor, have you seen this? But we have friends in Pakistan. Pakistan, the Christians are in a tiny minority. So Christians here are in a growing or a shrinking majority, let's say. In Pakistan, they're in a growing minority, a tiny minority. They have a disproportionate influence, and they don't have a single bit of political clout in a mostly Muslim nation. Why? Because Christians, for the most part, in that environment of extreme marginalization, live what they believe. And they are generally, according to our sources, very well respected amongst the larger Muslim population, and have a disproportionate influence to their numbers because of it. So maybe that's at least part of the way forward for us, as we can see the Christian church in the West becoming marginalized in the same way. All right. Well, that was a lot of moving parts on that. So hope that was helpful to you. But again, if you have something you'd like us to comment on, just get our take on it, see where we stand. Send it to social@ac3.org. We'd be happy to comment on it here on Pastor, Have You Seen This? Until next time, see you guys.